Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a recent reads with a depressing historical focus, basically. Hi, this is Future Me. I'm just jumping in quickly because I need to take this book, Angela Saini's Superior, The Return of Race Science, back to the library in an hour. This is a book about the section of science that is adjacent to human population biology. Human population biology is a legitimate field of research, but race science is not, because race is not the same as a human population. It's a social construct that people use for political and social control and whatnot. And this goes through the history of how things have been. The stereotype is obviously that drove a lot of things. For example, the scientists in Nazi Germany during the eugenics movements in the United States, things like that. But it points out that there is a lot more of this that both went on historically and that's going on in the present, and that there are still fringe journals in the English-speaking world that publish things that pretend that this kind of thing is real, and also that in countries with a certain type of nationalism, there is still, within their scientific communities, a drive to present things like parallel evolution in different parts of the world of humans, and especially in Russia, China, and India, that's part of a nationalistic movement to say, we, whatever the dominant group is, have always been here, which obviously problematic. Deboki from Okie Dokie Boki and Nicole Sweeney did an hour-long discussion about this a month or two ago. I will link to their discussion below. I thought this book was interesting. I did study human population biology, so a lot of it was not as new to me as it might be for people who are not familiar with the field at all. And a lot of the chapters I did think read like they could have been introductions to a book about the specific topic that the chapter dealt with. However, the reference section in here is great, so it does lead you to other things if you're interested in reading more. And if you were not familiar with the field at all, I do think this is very useful. It was shorter than I actually expected it to be, although I should have been able to look up the page count before I looked at it. Anyway, back to the pre-recorded stuff. Let's get more specifically depressing. I mentioned
Silent Steppe.
The subtitle on this is A Memoir of a Kazakh Nomad under Stalin. This is by Mukhamet Shayakhmetov, who was a teacher in Kazakhstan. He was in the Soviet armed forces during the Second World War, but prior to that, his father had been declared an enemy of the state, which meant that he couldn't go to school at one point. There was a lot of struggle. I mentioned this in the reading vlog that I posted last week, and I mentioned that Kazakhstan suffered a famine similar to the one that was in Ukraine. And if you're unfamiliar with engineered famines, you can think about what England did to, for example, Bengal in the 1940s or to Ireland in the 1840s. It was not something that a lot of imperial powers did when they wanted to kill a lot of their subjects without actively committing genocide, basically. So this author just lived through absolute horrors, but he presents it in a very matter-of-fact style. This could be absolutely gutting because there is so much death and so much horror surrounding the whole situation. But because he's so matter-of-fact about it, you almost feel as though you're getting it at an extra step removed. And I don't know how much of that is his actual writing and how much is the translation. This was translated by Butler. And I'm not sure if this would be stronger if it forged more of an emotional connection with you or not. It was definitely easier to read straight through for the fact that it didn't. But at the same time, I felt like this should have been more gutting than it was. It was still absolutely depressing. But yeah, it was also an interesting look into certain points in Soviet history. There's one point when he's trying to enlist when the Second World War starts. And initially, they only took the ethnic Russian and Tatar volunteers and didn't take the Kazakh or Uzbek volunteers. And they do eventually take them, but it's interesting that you see this, because there's such a common myth that in the Soviet times all of the ethnicities got together, and it was only when the Soviet Union collapsed that suddenly everybody went down the ethnic hatred route again. Route or route? I don't know. Tell me below. Anyway, and this clearly puts the lie to that. Like, there were clear ethnic tensions happening during the 1940s. It wasn't all happy collectivism. So it was definitely an interesting read. I almost said I look forward to reading more. Look forward is wrong. I do feel like I need to get even more context to this and do some more reading about Kazakhstan and in general. But yeah, it's well worth picking up. Another book that was not nearly as depressing as I anticipated it to be, at least again, in emotional engagement terms, was Guest House for Young Widows Among the Women of ISIS by Azadeh Moaveni. This follows a number of mostly young women from a variety of countries, including Germany, the UK, and Tunisia, who go to Syria to essentially become an occupying force. A couple of the women that she follows are local Syrian women, and in those parts I think you do get the emotional punch that you maybe expect from the title, because you do see how they are being occupied and how what started out as a civil war has become this international event that has just hordes of foreigners from all these different countries. So they talk about walking down the street, they're hearing English and German and French and Turkish and North African and Gulf dialects of Arabic, and you just think there is an extra horror to what's happening to these locals, because it's not just that they are in a war zone, it's that this has become this occupation. But that is not the primary focus of this. The people that we follow that we see the most focus on are a particular German, a group of particular British girls who are teenagers, one in particular who is in the news a lot lately, so I think some of these stories you will have heard before if you follow the news, and these two Tunisians. She starts out by looking at the situations within their home countries, both within the families, where we see a lot of people who are from very working class backgrounds, whose parents are not in economic situations where they're super involved in their children's lives, and how that's one piece of the puzzle, but it is not the only piece. In some ways I was reminded, when I was really young, like maybe 11 or 12 years old, I remember reading a magazine article about child soldiers and being just absolutely fascinated by it. And because I'm old, it wasn't like you could go online and find out more about that, right? Whereas these are girls who I think read about, you know, some of this thing and then were able to, I don't know, I mean, people talk about self-radicalizing, but yeah, I mean, essentially that's what they end up doing. And if you follow me on Goodreads, you might have noticed I originally gave this 5 stars and then I reduced it to 4. On my first read, I initially thought that there was a lot of kind of commentary about kind of classism and the intersection of classism and secularism, and in the British and German cases of a certain level of xenophobia as well. But I think a lot of the commentary is less explicit than I originally thought it was, because she does at the end follow this one Indonesian woman whose story baffled me, and I kept thinking I need more background about that, because I don't understand anything about her motivation or why her brothers thought they were going to go to Syria and not end up in military actions. And then I thought about this more, and I'm not clear if it was just that I came into the book knowing more about the rest of it, so I thought she was giving more commentary because that's kind of implicit if you have these pre-existing assumptions, and because I didn't have pre-existing assumptions about the Indonesian situation, I found that I didn't understand that part as much, or at least didn't have enough context. So I'm not clear if that was actually just a section where she didn't provide as much context, or if I just brought my own context to the rest of this book. So I thought that was something of a flaw to it, because again, the whole thing about the Indonesian family made no sense to me. There's also a bit at the end where she talks about 2 people who are trying to sneak across the border to get out of Syria, and it's written in very distinctly racial terms, in a way that on the one hand I'm sure is undoubtedly sort of true, but the way it's presented in such an absolute way seemed, I don't know, especially for anyone who's not familiar with the area at all, was really weird, because there's a situation where one of the women she follows is trying to cross the border into Turkey so she can just get out of Syria and not be in this zone anymore. And she's crossing with a Turkish woman who the author repeatedly refers to as a Turkess, which, like, Turk is not a gendered word, so I don't know where that came from. But one of her points is that the Turkish woman is very pale, parchment pale, she says, whereas this other woman could pass as Syrian. And I just thought, I know lots of very fair-skinned Syrians who are my color and blonde. And I did think that was super weird to have this strange racial focus, because on the one hand, yes, some people are obviously going to get thrown back over the border because they're recognized as being foreigners who crossed to join. So the whole way that situation was written about seemed fishy. I did think if there's a flaw, this did gloss over a lot of the really extreme crimes against humanity that did happen in the area. She is focused on a lot of these women who, because they were there, either because they followed men who were there to fight or because they went to marry men who were fighting. They were at home, they didn't necessarily see things, but I felt like that was missing from the context. On the flip side, that the context she provides surrounding political and social situations in Tunisia, in Germany, and in England were kind of leading in a way that I thought was an interesting choice, but felt like it was providing 65% of the information in which the situation would have called for somewhat more. So I did enjoy some of that because, I don't know, my bias is I like seeing Germans be poked about don't open your windows when you cook, don't vacuum on Sunday, things like that. You know, things that don't matter. But I think it's not really as much context as I would have liked. Still, overall, I really enjoyed is probably the wrong word, but this was a very compelling read, and I appreciated the variety of people that she followed. In the end, she talks about more people that she didn't specifically write about, and I wish we'd heard more about them. There are so many stories in this situation that I would have liked to have seen more of them. But yeah, this was very solid. And finally, I read a graphic memoir of sorts, probably closer to autofiction than memoir, and that was Tiananmen 1989. This follows a character that the author describes as his twin. So one can assume most of this is true, but he has maybe changed some bits and pieces to protect the innocent or the guilty, I suppose. And this is about the student movements in the lead up to the Tiananmen Square massacre. It has now been a couple of weeks since I read it, and while I found it very compelling as I was reading it, it has not stuck with me. There's some very good imagery surrounding the hunger strikers, for example, and there's a nice reference section where he talks about who's still alive, who disappeared, who has moved to the United States, who has moved to France, as the authors moved to France, things like that, which was all interesting, but I wouldn't say that this is the best Tiananmen Square memoir I have ever read. But if you have never read any, I think it's a solid introduction because it does go through a number of different elements, and I appreciated that, but I do find that 2 weeks out of having read it, I don't feel like I can talk about it much because it just hasn't stayed with me. I will insert some photos of the art as well, which was, again, good enough, but not super memorable. So yeah, if you have never read anything about what happened at Tiananmen Square in 1989, I certainly recommend this as a good introduction, but I wouldn't say that this should be the only book you read. But as a supplemental, I guess it's good enough. Anyway, I'm in the middle of more depressing nonfiction, so I'll be around to talk about that in another week or two. Alright, I think I'm losing my voice now, so I better wrap this up. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. That's it for now. Ciao.